Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Woods, and I am the Senior Curator at the Yorkshire Museum. Welcome to the first of our expert talks, which coincides with the museum's exhibition, the Ryedale Hoard, Roman Mystery. The purpose of these talks is to offer some deeper context for some of the themes and ideas in that exhibition, and I'm thrilled that today's speaker is Professor Michael Lewis from the British Museum. Before we get to Michael's talks, I just want to say that the Ryedale Roman Hoard exhibition is currently on display in the museum, and it places the hoard on display for the very first time for members of the public and contextualizes it with some of the outstanding Roman objects from other parts of our collection. If you want to see it, then you can find tickets on our website, and the exhibition is open until spring 2022. Just a little bit of housekeeping about the format of today's talk. It's being streamed live across YouTube and Facebook. And you'll be able to ask questions of Michael in the comments at any point during the course of the talk. I'll then ask some of those questions at the end of the talk. So please do add them as we're going along, and I'll choose some of them at the end to ask Michael. The talk will be available to view again afterwards via our YouTube channel, so please do tell a friend if you've enjoyed it. So then, admin aside, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Michael Lewis. Michael is head of the Portable Antiquities Scheme and Treasure at the British Museum. And the Portable Antiquities Scheme, you may hear it called PAS, is one of the largest public archaeology schemes in the world. It's recorded over 1.5 million objects found by members of the public since its inception. And these in turn have revolutionized our understanding about almost every period of British history. Michael's been a crucial part of that scheme and indeed has led it for most of the past decade. He's also widely published in his own right, with recent work analysing medieval markets and other medieval finds, and has recently co-authored a book, Finds Identified Too, which covers dress fittings and ornaments. It really is a fantastic introduction to the subject, illustrated with examples recorded by the Portable Antiquities Scheme. And I left my copy of it in the office earlier, otherwise I'd be holding it up at this moment in time, but I would encourage you all to check it out. But today, Michael will be speaking to us about a very pertinent topic in light of the Ryedale Hoard, with a title of Treasuring the Past, When is a Treasure Treasure? Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Andy, for your kind words. I'm just going to share the PowerPoint, so let me know when it's up and showing. How does that look?
Not quite there just yet.
Oh, wait a minute. Sorry about this.
Perfect.
How's that?
Perfect. We can see that. Fine.
Good. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to talk about when is treasure treasure. And to start with, we're going to have a bit of a quiz. Now, you can do this in several ways. You can either shout at your screen yourself. You can put it into the chat if you really feel like it, or you can just think about it and consider it at the end. Now, I was talking to a colleague earlier, and I think a lot of us agree that sometimes we have quite a personal view of what treasure is, but there's also a legal definition. And basically today, I'm going to talk about when treasure is really treasure. So here we go. You decide whether these are treasure finds or not. So the first find, and these are all but one from Yorkshire, are two copper alloy spearheads. One is broken on the right-hand side, and the other one is not. And they date to the Middle Bronze Age. Both were recorded with the Portable Antiquities Scheme, so they date to about 1550 to 800 BC, so they're pretty old. Now, they were found on separate occasions, but in the same place, in Kirkby Malham in North Yorkshire. So are they treasure or not treasure? Now, this one is the one, of course, that we're here for, the Ryedale Hoard, a bust of Marcus Aurelius, a plumbod, a horse and rider figurine, and the kind of part of a knife handle as well. So these were found, as we know, by detectives James Spark and Mark Didlick near Ampleforth in North Yorkshire. And as we know, they've been acquired by the Yorkshire Museum. But are these treasure? Surely they're treasure, aren't they? This is a hoard of 24 silver Roman coins that was found scattered by ploughing. Now, these were found at Cutterton in North Yorkshire in 2017. So they've been recorded by the Portable Antiquities Scheme, of course. But are these treasure? You make your mind up. One of the most famous treasures of all, so surely this is treasure, the Sutton Hoo treasure, excavated in 1939 by archaeologist Basil Brown on the direction of Mrs. Edith Pretty, who found these mounds on her land, or had these mounds on her land. As we know, these contained loads of amazing objects from the early Anglo-Saxon period. So surely this is treasure, isn't it? Another highlight of the Yorkshire Museum collection, but also shared with the British Museum, is the Vale of York Hoard. As I said, jointly acquired by the British Museum and the Yorkshire Museum. It's a Viking Age hoard of 617 silver coins and 65 other items. It was found by father and son detectorists Andrew and David Whelan in 2007. It seems that it was buried in about 927, although the pot that the whole hoard was contained in is earlier, it dates to the mid-9th century. So essentially, it's a lot of objects from all around the Viking world that have been put into a single container and buried in the ground. That was Viking treasure, but is it really treasure for us today? And the last find that you're going to consider is this small, it's a small cufflink. Upon it, you can see a design of the heart and crown motif associated with Charles II and Catherine of Braganza, who got married in 1662. Small item, but is this treasure? Now, this really is by means of introduction to the Treasure Act 1996, which defines what is treasure and what's not treasure. Now, as you will see, we'll come back to some of those finds that we looked at a moment ago and decide whether they are treasure and why they're not treasure, or whether they are treasure and they could be treasure. But to start with, I'm just going to give a little bit of a background about the legislation in England and Wales regarding finding archaeological objects. The first thing that's probably important to say is the United Kingdom is not a United Kingdom in terms of its legislation regarding portable antiquities. So today I'm going to talk just about the law in England and Wales, because Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own legislation.
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're just having a slight technical problem with our YouTube viewers. So can I just ask you to pause for a moment?
Okay.
And okay, now we're working again now. So sorry to jump in and interrupt, but please do continue. It's now working.
Okay, no problem.
Apologies.
So the first thing to probably say is that anybody can look for archaeological finds as long as they have the landowner's permission. Now, in this image here, you can see a field in Oxfordshire, and all of those dots in the field are detectorists looking for archaeological finds. Now, in many countries in Europe, this would not be permitted at all. But in England and Wales, it is quite legal for people to go out and search for archaeological finds, as long as they have the landowner's permission. However, there are protected sites, and this is an example, a famous example, Stonehenge. There's many thousands of protected sites in England and Wales where people cannot go and detect without permission from the state, in essence from Historic England or Cadw in Wales. There's also restrictions on metal detecting in certain places. Now, this is a park in London where it says that you're not allowed to drive vehicles, play golf, or go metal detecting. So there can be local bylaws that restrict the use of metal detectors. And also, probably one of the most important obligations is to report all treasure finds. Now, I'm going to talk now briefly about what the definition of treasure is. Sorry, my slide seems to jump on ahead of itself. I don't know why that is. But just to kind of summarize what I've talked about already, The key things to take away are the landowner, not the state, has best title to most archaeological finds found on their land, apart from treasure. So the treasure laws have their origins in medieval law, and that law said that all gold and silver objects had to be reported by law. These objects, generally speaking, are gold or silver, and the legislation that we used to have called treasure trove said that these objects had to be buried with the intention of recovery, and the original owner or the heir of those objects has to be unknown. Now, like I said, this law, treasure trove, has now been superseded, but some parts of it still apply. Thinking about the Sutton Hoo treasure, because that was in 1939, before the previous legislation, it would have applied under the law of treasure trove. Now, I'm not going to give too much away now, but we'll return to this a bit later. So I'm now going to go through what objects are treasure, and this is where you can start thinking again about those original finds and think about whether any of them fit this criteria. So the law says that all objects other than coins at least 300 years old with at least 10% gold or silver are treasure. Now, this object here is the Ringlemere Cup that was acquired by the British Museum and is actually on display at the moment in the British Museum Stonehenge exhibition. In the case of coins, it gets a little bit more complicated. All coins from the same find, provided they're at least 300 years old, have to be reported. If they have less than 10% gold or silver, there has to be 10 or more of them. So 2 or more if they're gold or silver, 10 or more if they're of a base metal. Getting slightly more complex still, all objects that are found with treasure or associated with treasure are also treasure. Now, there's some fascinating examples that have popped up of objects in association with treasure, but the most common examples are pots within which coins are found. So, for example, here, the coins, because there's more than 10 or more of them and they're base metal, are treasure, and the container that they were in is also treasure because it's associated with the original treasure find. Now, the law allows the Secretary of State to add to the criteria new criteria of artifacts that could be treasure. And the last time this happened was in 2003, when a designation order made prehistoric base metal assemblages treasure. So this is an example from Wales, where you can see some Bronze Age axe heads. These were all found together and therefore fit the definition of treasure. Now, it's important to say that if one of these was found on its own, it wouldn't be treasure, but because it's found with other ones, it is. And just to confuse things perhaps a little bit more on this definition, it's also the case that finds are not treasure under the current legislation, so the Treasure Act 1996, but would have been treasure trove, are also treasure. So this is an interesting example of a hoard of South African gold coins that was discovered during the lockdown period. Now, it wouldn't meet the current definition of treasure, but it met the old definition of treasure, by which objects that were buried with the intention of recovery, whatever their age, could be treasure as well. So it fits that criteria. Now, as you can appreciate, this legislation is quite complicated for people sometimes to get their head around. And so it's very important for us to be communicating to people who have reported their finds on why their objects might fulfill the definition of the Act. Now, I'm going to talk very quickly now about how the treasure process sort of works, or what people have to do. First of all, the kind of legal sanctions. So the obligation under the Act is for a finder to report a find to the local coroner in the district in which it was found within 14 days of realising the find may be treasure. Now, the realising bit is quite important, because it might be that you find treasure as you discovered it. You might have found a find and suddenly realise, oh yes, this should be reported within to the Act, then the clock starts ticking. But imagine someone finds something and they didn't know it was treasure, and then they show it to someone else and they say, oh, I think this could be treasure. Then the clock starts ticking, not the time that they find it. So the whole law was really designed to ensure people do the right thing, not necessarily to prosecute them. Saying that, there is a penalty within the legislation of a 3 months imprisonment or a £5,000 fine, or both. And in fact, there have been sentences more severe than that under other legislation used alongside the treasure legislation. Now, this is a chart that briefly shows what happens in terms of a find going through the treasure process. So when a find is made, it has to be reported, as I've said already, to the coroner in the district in which it was found. Now, sometimes people report those finds to their local finds liaison officer. Now, I'll talk about finds liaison officers in a little bit. So the find then has to be deposited with that person, or that person, the finds liaison officer, will instruct them what to do with it. Now, although the legal obligation is to report the find to the coroner, it does satisfy the requirements of the Act if they tell the finds liaison officer. They can report it through them if you like. Then the finds liaison officer, perhaps working with other people like curators at the local or the National Museum, will produce a report on that find. And this is a report that is submitted to the coroner to say that this find fulfills the definition of the Act and why it does. Then the finds liaison officer will look to see if any museum wishes to acquire the object. Now, this is the fundamental point of the legislation. It's to ensure that the most important archaeological finds can be acquired by museums. And it will take us, we'll come back to this later, because most important archaeological finds is something we need to bear in mind. What are they, and how do we determine those? If a museum wishes to acquire the object, then it carries on through the process. If a museum does not wish to acquire the object, then it is disclaimed by the Crown and normally returned to the finder and the landowner, and they can do what they like with it. However, if the find is desired by a museum, then an inquest is held, a coroner's inquest, and the coroner will formally declare whether the object is treasure or not. If a museum still wants to acquire the find, then the find is valued by an independent committee known as the Treasure Valuation Committee, and a reward is made to the finder equal to the value of that find. Now, that is normally shared again equally between the finder and the landowner, unless they have an agreement otherwise. Then the museum has to raise the money to pay the reward, as I've said, equal to the value. And sometimes, of course, and we'll probably return to this in some of the questions, sometimes museums are not able to meet that reward and therefore do not acquire. Other times they might. Now, this is a chart that shows the number of treasure cases that have been reported over recent years. Well, ever since the Act came into force, actually. So the Act came into force in 1997, and as you can see, there's been a gradual increase. There was a massive increase in 2003, which is explained by the creation of the Portable Antiquities Scheme, a project to record archaeological finds made by the public, which I'll return to in a bit. And as you can see, since then, the number of treasure cases has risen significantly. I suppose nowadays we get about 1,200 cases reported a year. Now, it's important to say that these cases might be a single object, or they might be many objects that have been found together, a hoard, for example. Now, this is a map showing England and Wales, and it shows the museums that have acquired treasure. And as you can see, the Yorkshire Museum is up there in one of the museums that have acquired many, many treasure finds. As you can see, they're found all over the country, and they're acquired by museums all over the country as well. They have to be registered museums, and we reckon that over 5,600 cases, probably more than like 6,000 nowadays, treasure finds, so individual finds and hoards of finds, have been acquired by over 200 museums across the country. Now I'm going to turn to the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which, as I've said, is a project to record archaeological finds made by the public. Now, whilst we sometimes divide the Portable Antiquities Scheme from the treasure legislation, the Portable Antiquities Scheme is absolutely fundamental to the delivery of the Act. Now, this is the Yorkshire Museum, and the stars on this map represent the bases of all of the finds liaison officers. We have 40 finds liaison officers across the country. These are archaeologists who are small finds experts. Their main job is to record archaeological finds that are made by the public. And these finds can be made by anyone. They can be found by metal detector users, they can be found by field walkers, they can be found by people going out walking, they might be found by people digging in their gardens. And I'll return to the types of finders in a little bit. All of the finds liaison officers, as I've suggested, are based in different organisations across the country. Some of them are based within museums, some of them are based within historic environment records, for example, or county council services. So they can be in many bases, but fundamentally they link up with all of the museums and other cultural institutions in their area to ensure that people have the widest opportunities to report the archaeological finds that they discover. Now, this isn't the finds liaison officer from Yorkshire, but I like this picture because it shows part of the work of the finds liaison officer talking to finders and others about the archaeological finds that they discover. And as you can see here, they're looking at a lot of medieval buckles. Now, the fundamental purpose of the Portable Antiquities Scheme is to record archaeological finds so they advance archaeological knowledge. And as Andy said at the beginning, the scheme has kind of radically changed the way that we understand the archaeology of this country. To date, the Portable Antiquities Scheme has recorded over 1,500 finds. These figures here were accurate of a few days ago, but they'll be out of date now. Essentially, anyone can go onto the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, which is www.finds.org.uk, and they can learn about what's been discovered in their local area. You can see, as you can see in this image on the right, a record of the object, images of the object, and you can also look and see where those objects were found. Now, I have to point out here that we limit the amount of information on the public database in terms of the locational information of the find. Most metal detectorists in particular are very sensitive about who knows about where they're finding archaeological finds for obvious reasons. And therefore we restrict the accuracy or the precision of those find spots, if you like, on the online database. But it's made fully available for people wanting to use it for research purposes, such as archaeologists or people in universities doing research on archaeological finds. On the left-hand side, you can see a heat map that shows where these archaeological discoveries are made. And you can see that there's a big hotspot, if you like, in East Anglia, but there's lots of finds being made across the eastern part of the country and the southern part of the country as well. Obviously, these reflect two things. One is where people lived in the past. It might be not known to many of us, but East Anglia was a hotbed of the population for many years, particularly in the medieval period. And also it's where metal detecting is most prevalent, mostly where land is ploughed. Now, looking at the Portable Antiquities Scheme by period, it probably will be quite remarkable to many people to learn that most of the finds, about a third of them, I suppose, date to the Roman period, followed by the medieval and then the post-medieval period. Now, of course, many more post-medieval finds are being found than the chart here shows. But we in the Portable Antiquities Scheme are really selective in recording post-medieval material culture. Essentially, if it's been machine-made or mass-produced, we're going to be quite selective in what we record, concentrating on those unique man-made objects. Now, as I suggested earlier, many of the finds that are recorded with the Portable Antiquities Scheme are found by the metal detecting community. They represent the vast majority of finds that are being made. Now, that's probably no surprise, of course, because metal detector users are going out there proactively searching for archaeological material whilst many other people aren't. People, generally speaking, aren't digging their gardens and looking in their flower beds for archaeological finds. They just might spot something by chance and think, oh, this is something interesting, and then hopefully will show it to their local finds liaison officer or their local museum. Now, an important point to sort of recognise is that most of these finds are being made on cultivated land. So the objects are being brought to the surface by the plough. They're not being picked up, as it were, by metal detector users from within an archaeological context. This is very important, of course, from an archaeological perspective, because it's really, really important that people don't damage in situ archaeological layers, so ground that's not been disturbed. So the plough essentially is bringing objects to the surface, and metal detector users are finding those objects. Now, of course, from time to time, people do dig below the plough, and if they do and they find something in situ that's been undisturbed, such as a hoard of coins, etc., then we ask them to get in touch with us so that they can be excavated archaeologically. Now, as I've said before, and Andy mentioned at the beginning, the research potential of the Portable Antiquities Scheme is one of the major benefits that it brings. New archaeological sites are being discovered all of the time. Not all of them are excavated, but some of them are. And this is an example in Devon of a Roman site that was found by a couple of detectors essentially reporting their discoveries, which led to an excavation by the University of Exeter. We also have, as I've suggested earlier, people doing PhDs and other sorts of research on the back of Portable Antiquities Scheme data. And I think it's probably fair to say that nowadays, no one doing any serious academic research on the archaeological landscape or archaeological finds can ignore the data produced by metal detectorists and others reported through the Portable Antiquities Scheme. And of course, the scheme gets quite a lot of attention. Sometimes people probably don't realise that it's associated with the Portable Antiquities Scheme, but this is, for example, the headlines in a local paper in Yorkshire that highlighted a Roman figurine that had been reported through the Portable Antiquities Scheme. And some of you may have seen a new television series on More 4 called Great British History Hunters, that is about the work of metal detector community reporting their finds to the Portable Antiquities Scheme. Now, it's really important for me to emphasise the fact that whilst people can go out there metal detecting, as long as they have the landowner's permission, it's... Sorry about that, that's an announcement now from the British Museum that the galleries are closed here. So, yes, it's really important for me to emphasise that whilst anybody can go out there and search for archaeological finds, it's really important that they follow the guidelines that have been produced with the archaeological and metal detecting community. So since 2017, we've had a revised version of the Code of Practice for Responsible Metal Detecting in England and Wales. And this outlines what people should do before they go metal detecting, whilst they go metal detecting, and after they go metal detecting. The emphasis is on ensuring that people do not damage in situ archaeology whilst they're detecting, and afterwards they report any archaeological finds that they make. We've also produced an article, a leaflet aimed at the landowners organisations as well, or landowners, which outlines the kind of rights that landowners have regarding archaeological finds. Obviously, as I've emphasised a number of times now, because finders have to get permission from the landowner, landowners are really, really important in ensuring that people follow best practice when they detect on their land. Now, I love this photograph. This is one of our finds liaison officers, Joe, excavating a Bronze Age hoard in Kent. And as you can see, everyone involved in the discovery of this find is looking in and watching what he's doing, including the metal detector users who found the hoard, the landowner and their relatives. And also, we've even got the British Museum curator there looking in to ensure that Joe's doing a good job of the excavation of those finds. Now, the reason I show this image is it's an important one. an important point, really. And that is that people do stop when they find something in situ, so it can be properly excavated. And as you can see, this is the results of what's happening here. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit now about reforming treasure law. So as I've mentioned, the legislation that's been put in place has been there since 1997, and it's worked well for a number of years. And as you've seen, an amazing number of archaeological finds have been reported both as part of the Portable Antiquities Scheme and within the treasure law. But from time to time, we kind of reflect on how the legislation has been working. And this is what I want to talk about now for the next few minutes until we have questions. So we're going to go back to the beginning where we saw these archaeological finds. And I'm going to test to see whether you've got it right here. So this slide shows all the finds that were treasure when they were found. Now, actually, one of these is only half treasure, and I'll try and explain that now. So in the case of the Bronze Age material at the top, these two objects are treasure because they were found together, and the legislation says that any prehistoric base metal assemblages are treasure. Now, this case is slightly complicated by the fact that one find was found on its own, and then a time after the other one was found. So the first find wouldn't be treasure because it wasn't found with anything, but the second one was because it was found with the first. Bit complicated, but anyway, that's treasure. Now, the Vale of York hoard, I'd be surprised if anyone didn't think that this was treasure. I mean, it is an amazing archaeological find, and it's so brilliant, of course, that it's in a museum collection. Now, it's obviously treasure to us in terms of the eye, and it also meets the definition of treasure as well. So therefore, it is treasure. Now, the Roman coins on the top right-hand side, even though they're scattered, we know that they are from a hoard, and they were originally once together, and it's the plough that's done the work of dividing them, not anything else. So therefore, because there's two or more silver coins found in the same place, they are treasure also. Now, what about the button? Maybe that's a bit of a surprise for you, that the button that's part of a cufflink is also treasure. Now, quite a lot of these have turned up, and it's an object type that I'm quite fascinated in myself. But some people, when they're thinking about the items that are not treasure, might be surprised that this is treasure. Now, the legislation says that any gold or silver objects over 300 years old, these were made in probably about 1662, are treasure, as long as they're 10% gold or silver, and this is over 10% silver. Now, what about the objects that are not treasure? Now, I think most of us will be quite surprised that neither the Sutton Hoo treasure was treasure when it was found, and the Ryedale Hoard was not treasure either. So in terms of the Sutton Hoo, I mean, look at this amazing object from the Sutton Hoo burial. It's unbelievable to think that that was determined not to be treasure. Now, the reason it wasn't treasure is because the Sutton Hoo treasure was found in 1939 under the old law of treasure trove. And the law of treasure trove, as I said at the beginning, says that something has to be buried with the intention of recovery to be treasure. Okay, it's gold or silver, but the idea here is that the people that buried these objects in the ship burial at Sutton Hoo never intended to come back for them. And therefore, the coroner in 1939 declared that these objects were not treasure under the treasure trove legislation. Now, thankfully for us, for all of us, and especially the British Museum, Mrs. Pretty, who was the landowner, decided that the objects should be given to a public institution, and she decided to donate those to the British Museum. Now, the story could have been very different, of course. She could have decided not to do that. She could have decided to sell those on the open market. And can you imagine what we would have all been thinking now if the Sutton Hoo treasure was broken up and sold? Now, likewise, the Ryedale Hoard is not treasure. It's not, it was found within the current legislation, which says that only objects that are gold or silver or prehistoric assemblages are treasure. So it's a Roman object, so it's not prehistoric. And although it's an assemblage, it obviously doesn't fulfill that criteria. And since it's Roman, it would have to be gold or silver to be treasure. So in this case, again, we have an object which I think most of us would agree is treasure in most of our minds, but the legislation says is not treasure. Hence highlighting, whilst there's been a lot of thought about changing or reforming, if you like, the Treasure Act. Now, the next slide highlights a couple of more objects that have popped up in relatively recent years, both Roman in date, both base metal, and both not covered by the treasure legislation, the current treasure legislation. The first one on the left is the Crosby Garrett helmet that was found in Cumbria. This has been restored heavily. It was sold at auction, and now it remains in a private collection, so it's not on public display. The second find was found in Gloucestershire. It's a dog, but it was also found with some other Roman objects. Again, there was no obligation for the finders to report this under the treasure legislation, but it was recorded by the Portable Antiquities Scheme. But of course, the museum didn't have a legal opportunity to acquire this object. So I think it kind of brings us back to the start, really. When is treasure treasure? Well, treasure's only treasure when it fits the legal definition of treasure. But I think we can all agree that in our minds, treasure can be lots of other things. Now, the government is minded to revise the Treasure Act, and in fact, the process has begun now to look at a new definition for treasure, well, adding a new definition to the treasure. It's very likely that the current definitions will stand, but they will also add a significance-based definition. Now, this is interesting, and maybe we'll have a bit of a discussion about it, because how do you measure significance? Now, I'm not a Romanist, but I can still see that the Ryedale Hoard is terrifically important, and it's right to be in a museum. But there are other objects which it's harder to make that case, perhaps. Maybe they're more common. Is it just about uniqueness? Does completeness sometimes make us think about these finds in a slightly different way as well? So what the government is minded to do is to introduce a significance-based definition, and that means that something could be treasure if it meets the definition of significance. Now, what's crucial here is how do we determine that? Now, the expectations are that the threshold will be fairly high, but I know the government is very keen that there would also be an opportunity to consider things not only in a national level, but also at a regional level. Now, the nature of archaeology in this country is that objects can be found in some areas that are really common, and they can be found in other areas where they're really, really rare. And so an object, for example, that's important for Yorkshire might not be important for Cumbria, or vice versa. So the key here is how do we understand what significance is, and how do we assess objects on a similar basis going through this process. Now, it's going to be a challenge, but I think we probably all agree, hopefully we all agree, that it is important that the most important archaeological finds enter into museum collections. And I think that's the thing that I want to sort of end with, really, before we have a period of questions. I want us to think about, why do we have this legislation? The purpose of this legislation is to ensure that the most important archaeological finds end up in museum collections, so those objects can be enjoyed by the widest number of people. I think people would be really surprised, for example, if the Sutton Hoo treasure was not on display in the museum, that they could not enjoy it. I think they would be surprised if it was broken up on the open market, for example, and people could just buy bits of it. So I think it goes back to that sort of age-old saying that archaeologists have, that the past belongs to us all. But what is the past And, how do we determine what is the best way of sharing that amongst us all? So that's the end. Thank you very much. And we're going to have some questions now, I think.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was fascinating, actually, to, I guess, see the process all the way from the beginning to the end, and then to hear about the possibilities, but also the challenges of that significance-based assessment. So thank you very much for, I'm sure our audience would agree, that was really kind of interesting and comprehensive approach to it. So at this point in time, I'm going to invite questions from those watching on Facebook or on YouTube. If you want to drop them into the comment, I'm very happy to do my best to answer them. Sorry, I won't be answering them. I will pass those on to Michael, and he can answer those. So just while I'm waiting for those comments to come in, and we're on a slight delay, I might just take the moment to ask one myself, which is, how does the situation in England compare to other countries? Do they have different approaches to treasure, or similar to what we have?
Yeah, so probably quite an important point to make, really, is that, I mean, England probably has one of the most liberal laws regarding archaeological finds compared with most other countries in Europe. There are some that are similar to us. So, for example, in Denmark, they have treasure legislation, which is known as Danafay. Essentially, all archaeological, well, not all, most archaeological finds, well, Danafay is essentially treasure, I suppose, and they have a wider criteria of objects than we have in England. So there's more objects that fit the legislation. Essentially, it's decided by curators at the National Museum about whether an object is treasure or not, and therefore whether a reward will be paid for those objects or not as well. In countries like the Netherlands, they don't have any treasure legislation whatsoever, but you have to have a permit to go metal detecting. So it works in a slightly different way, whereby people have to report their finds, and then if a museum wants to have them, then there's a sort of negotiation, if you like, between the finders and the museum. But I think it's probably fair to say that in most other countries, such as the Republic of Ireland, France, most of Central and Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, like Italy, Spain, it is completely prohibited for essentially, well, I think metal detecting is heavily restricted, if not prohibited, and most archaeological finds are claimed by the state. So there's no sort of question about rewards in most cases. It's just the state has it, really.
Thank you. We've got a question from Emily on Facebook, which is well, the big question, I suppose. What does a new definition of treasure look like to you?
What does it look like? Yeah, well, I think I think we have to be realistic, don't we, about what's achievable. I know a lot of archaeologists would love the idea that everything that's archaeological ends up in a museum collection. And there may be curators, I don't want to put words into your mouth, Andy, but there's curators like yourself that would kind of dread the idea that they'd have to sort of deal with every archaeological find that's ever been found. I think there's a reality to the situation that there's obviously objects that are really, really important, and everybody agrees that they should be in museum collections. So Ryedale Hoard is a fine example, isn't it, really? That I think most people who see it say, yeah, a museum is the right place for this object. Now, those cufflinks that I'm quite, into, that we showed a picture of, I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that it's good to have examples of those in, museum collections. But do we need every one that's ever been found? So I think for me, the significance-based definition, and it would be something that I think would learn over time about how it sort of best works, is about starting at the top and then thinking around it. But also within the Portable Antiquities Scheme, we've been really keen to start the sort of discussion about thinking about this as well from a practical sort of level. I think we do have to consider how objects fit into kind of regional sort of frameworks. Is something important? Why is something important in a local context as much as a national context? And how does it help to tell those stories? So yeah, for me, I think it's about how objects can be used to, one, enhance our understanding of the past. I think within a museum context, and Andy, you know more about this than me, about how they can tell stories to bring the past to life? You know, how do they work to do that? There's obviously an element of uniqueness to them as well. And I think we'd be lying if we didn't say that the aesthetics sometimes of objects is important to some degree. Not the overriding thing, of course, but that does come into importance for how things can be understood by people as well.
Thank you, Michael. That's a very full answer to a slightly tricky question. So thank you very much for that. I guess picking up on that point a little bit is that there's a question from Caroline, which says that flint axes in Shropshire are rare. Should they be considered significant, even though they're just made of stone?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't think the material composition of the object is key. I think it's about what these objects tell us about the past. And I think it could be the case, for example, that an object that's made of another sort of material, you know, could really shed new light on the past and be really important for a local museum to acquire, or even a national museum for that matter. So I kind of, you know, I don't think we should be limited in, you know, holding back ourselves as long as the case can be made. I think the way it would work in practice, and this is me guessing here because we don't know yet, is that as it does now, is that a case would have to be made to a coroner. A coroner is the kind of independent person that would look at these examples. So at the moment, they look at cases of gold and silver objects to see whether they meet the definition. Now, in some ways, that you could argue that job's fairly straightforward, but sometimes it might not be. You know, a coin hoard can be broken up, and it's not very clear whether bits were found together or associated with each other, and they have to draw on experts to kind of understand that relationship between those objects. So likewise, I think, you know, it might be that archaeologists think, yeah, this is really important, and then you know, archaeologists think it's really important, but I think that case has to be heard by somebody independent to say, okay, you make the case and we'll hear it, and then we'll see what happens. I think, though, I mean, from my experience, there's a lot of finders that are quite pleased that an object is treasure because it makes things a lot more straightforward. Because sometimes objects come up really that people believe should be in a museum collection, and it's harder for that to sort of happen. And, you know, people are under different sorts of pressure, you know, either, you know, because of their relationship with a landowner or another finder or whatever it might be. So sometimes when there's a process, it makes things simpler, in fact.
Thanks, Michael. I might just abuse my speaker's privilege again and ask another question, which is, I was quite struck by your kind of graphs about how much treasure was being reported and the effects of the change in the law, and up towards 1,200 cases per year reported. I was wondering, with my kind of museum hat on, do you see a similar increase in the amount of treasure being acquired? And is it kind of, or has it sort of peaked and then dropped off as museums have struggled in the last couple of years, for example, with COVID?
Yeah, it's probably something I didn't really kind of sort of emphasize enough probably in the talk, is that, you know, that being treasure is one thing and museums acquiring it is something else. Now, I think the reality is that there's things that meet the current definition of the treasure legislation that not many museums are interested in acquiring because they're quite common finds, or they have representative examples in their collection, or whatever it might be. But there's a reality that kind of hangs in the background, that the finder's reward is essentially, and the landowner's reward is essentially raised by the museum. So the museum has to find that money. Now, there's places, of course, that they can go to, funding bodies that kind of support that. But I mean, and how do I phrase this easily? Probably not. I'll just say it. Is that, you know, some museums are better at raising that money than others, and also some curators, you know, are more familiar with the arguments to make to get that kind of funding than others. But even when that is the case, decisions have to be made, of course. And Andy, you're probably better to answer this question than I am, because you're the person that has to do this. But essentially, you know, it may be that in a year, you know, just a couple of cases, you know, turn up and you can say, right, okay, we can go for all of these because we've got the resources to go for them, in terms of not necessarily the money, but the manpower, if you like, to invest the time to raise the money. But other years, you might say that there's just too many. We're going to have to just decide which one we're going to go for. So I think there is a reality to the situation, that it's not the case that just because, you know, a third of them are acquired by museums, they are the only third that museums want. they are the only thirds that they can, invest the resources in doing and achieving that essentially. And like I said, there's a lot of smaller museums in the country which do not have the curatorial expertise to acquire these objects or have the time to acquire those objects, and they need support really for that to be effective. So we need to. I think one thing we lack in this country is a sort of joined up approach to dealing with treasure acquisition. Essentially, I think more could be done in that area to ensure that the most important finds do end up in museums, because that's the aim of the legislation at the end of the day. And as you kind of infer, I think, with any significance-based definition, that is just going to add to the complexity of those decisions that museums need to make in terms of what they're going to acquire. We can have all of the legislation we want in the world, and say all of these things can fit the criteria of treasure, but if museums don't acquire them, then you're just wasting your time, aren't you, really? So that's the crucial thing to happen. Museums acquire these objects.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it is a challenge for museums as much as it is for yourselves, and the kind of the legal definition in that definitely would require a different thought processes in museums. And I dare I say that you could get all of the museum curators in your 200 museums together and ask them what's significant, and you might get 200 different answers. So I can see that DCMS or yourselves in trying to come up with a definition will. Yes, it may be something of a challenge, dare I say.
I feel though it will evolve over time. Though I think that's where it's important to have those conversations with curators to understand, what kind of, how that significance relates to collecting, essentially.
But I think your most fundamental point of your talk, in that Sutton Hoo and Ryedale, you can kind of tell they should be treasure, and thus we need to change something here, is spot on. So it's just trying to draw a legal boundary around that is the challenge, perhaps. There's a question which I think has disappeared somewhere, but there's a sort of your 300-year boundary or treasure. Obviously, that's going to keep moving as we move through time, and we're going to move into. I think you described them as sort of machine mass-produced things at some point. Is there ever any thought about, say, fixing that date at any point?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of sort of thought about. I mean, I can't obviously talk for the DCMS, but I think it's not as straightforward as it seems just to kind of have a cut-off date. I think originally when the government put out the consultation, they did talk about having a physical cut-off date to kind of avoid that issue, because I think that will be there. My personal view is that there needs to be an end date, really. I think 300 years, because it keeps going rolling and rolling and rolling, and we're getting into an area like you say of lots of mass-produced material, will mean that a lot of stuff will have to go through the treasure process but not be acquired. And for me, that just seems like a waste of resource, essentially, and not particularly efficient. I think these objects have to be recorded. I mean, I'm not denying that. And I think there has to be that process. And of course, it could be that something is significant still of that's of a later sort of date. So in some ways, you don't want to lose that opportunity that something from, I don't know, 1800 turns up, and it could really be something that's been makes a useful addition to a museum collection. But yeah, I think that's always been the balance with the treasure legislation, really, is how do you have something that is straightforward to understand, which I think in many ways, although it sounds like it might not always be, in terms of the way I've kind of explained it, have something that's fairly simple, but also has the most practical use and efficient use of resources as well. And I think there's a danger with us getting, with that 300-year date rolling into a period of mass production, that we could be spending a lot of time dealing with bits and bobs that no one wants to acquire, essentially.
Thank you. A question that was perhaps inspired by your last one, which is, again, maybe not the most straightforward one to answer, but if there's an increase in the amount of items declared as treasure, how can we ensure that the government understands the impact of museums not being able to acquire those most significant finds?
Yeah, if there's an increase in the amount of items, how can we ensure the government funds? Well, I think I think everyone understands the sort of impact of this. I don't think there's a sort of denial that this is a sort of a sort of problem or a challenge. I mean, in some ways, you could argue it's a nice problem to have you have the opportunity to acquire these objects, but you know, you have to make decisions about them. I think it's probably important to say that it's not just about money; it's about other sorts of processes as well. Like I said, it's about how people make those sorts of judgments and whether they're commonplace. I mean, I think one of the things that I kind of think pops up now and again is because objects have this treasure label, they're sometimes seen as more significant than other objects. And how do you kind of, you know, how do you kind of make people understand that that might not necessarily be the case? So it's a bit like the whole purpose of this talk, really. You know, when's treasure treasure? I mean, in some ways, that's a legal definition. And of course, there are objects at the moment that aren't treasure that you know, that should be in museum collections, and that probably will always be the case, even with the significance-based definition. You know, there will be people saying, well, you know, this coin has got a, I don't know, a C the other way around, and it's the first one we've had of those. That should really be in a museum collection or something. And most other people kind of not really get why that's important, like myself. But you know, but obviously numismatists would think, oh, well, my gosh, that's so important. That really should be in a museum collection. So there's always going to be those sorts of discussions. But I mean, but the fundamental problem, of course, is that if really important finds or even very important finds are not being acquired by museums, and essentially that is, like I said, completely a resource issue, isn't it? Both in terms of people and in terms of money. In Denmark, for example, the pot seems to be a large one, which is a state pot. So essentially the curators say, yeah, we want this in the museum collection, and a reward is paid by the finder. Now, the rewards, as I understand it, in some countries, including Denmark, aren't necessarily the full market value of the finds. So they are fairly similar, I think, in Denmark, but in some countries it's more of a token gesture. So the question is, you know, I suppose, you know, if the rewards weren't so much, then, you know, could museums acquire more? Which obviously they could. But then is that fair to the finders who, you know, follow the legislation? So it's not necessarily straightforward, but it essentially comes down to money, doesn't it, really? You know, how much money is there to play with?
Yes, I think never quite enough in museums is the long and short of it, as in many things. We're just approaching 5:30, so that is kind of the end of those questions. And thank you very much for answering some fairly big questions as openly and thoughtfully as you have done, Michael. It is very much appreciated, and I'm sure our audience would agree with that. Just to, before we wrap up, I will just point out a couple of the forthcoming talks for those who may be interested. So the next of our talks is on the 16th of June at 5:15 p.m. when Lucy Crichton, who's our curator of archaeology at the Yorkshire Museum, will be delivering a short talk titled Up Close with the Ryedale Hoard. And then the next of our expert talks will be on the 21st of July at 4:30 p.m. When Dr. Owen Humphreys from Museum of London Archaeology will be talking about metals, making and magic, the Smith in Roman Britain. And I will be practicing that title before I introduce the talk in July. And there are details of those talks and reminder newsletter and the like on our website. So you can find all of the details there for those and the other 8 talks in the programme. So then just the last thing to say is a really very much a huge thank you to Michael Lewis for taking the time to speak to us today. It was a hugely fascinating talk about a complex but hugely important process. So thank you very much, Michael.
No problem, thank you.